The Diane and Alan Johnson case. The tranquil hum of a suburban Tuesday morning in Bellevue, Idaho, was shattered by a frantic pounding on a front door. A neighbor, Kim Richards, opened her door to a scene of profound distress. Her neighbor's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Johnson, stood barefoot on the porch, trembling uncontrollably in a nightgown. Her face was a mask of terror, streaked with tears as she delivered a chilling message. Her parents had been murdered. A call was placed to 911, and the quiet of the neighborhood was replaced by the wail of sirens. Law enforcement officials, including Sergeant Walt Femling, arrived at the Johnson residence. The house stood immaculate, a silent testament to a life of peace and order. Stepping through the open front door, a palpable silence filled the air, heavy and unnatural. A trail of faint footprints led to the master bedroom, where a gruesome scene awaited. Diane Johnson, 52, lay in her bed, a dark stain blooming across her pillow from a gunshot wound to the head. Blood spattered the headboard and the ceiling above, a gruesome constellation against the otherwise pristine white. She appeared to have been killed in her sleep. On the floor beside the bed lay the body of her husband, Alan Johnson, 46, clad only in a towel. He lay in a growing pool of blood, a detail that spoke of a routine morning interrupted by unspeakable violence. An initial theory of murder-suicide was considered, given the .264 caliber Winchester rifle lying nearby. However, the scene held too many inconsistencies. A faint, steady sound of running water led Sergeant Femling to the ensuite bathroom, where the shower was on. Blood spatter and a single bullet hole on the shower wall revealed a new truth. This was a calculated crime, not a frantic act of self-destruction. The tidy narrative of a husband driven to madness and then suicide began to fall apart, and a long and twisted investigation began. The house became a methodical machine for collecting data. Forensic specialists in white jumpsuits meticulously documented every detail. The rifle, a tool of sport turned into a weapon of death, lay on the bedroom floor. A search of the property revealed a guest house rented by a close friend of Alan's, Mel Spiegel. His convenient disappearance made him an instant person of interest. The investigation took a pivotal turn when the police, acting on a hunch, impounded the Johnsons' trash cans. Inside, a bundled-up pink bathrobe contained a gruesome collection of evidence: a latex glove, a single brown leather glove, and ammunition for a .25 caliber gun. The discovery of these items was a breakthrough, a tangible link to the perpetrator. All the evidence was sent for DNA testing. The killer, it was deduced, knew about the unlocked doors and the garbage pickup schedule, key pieces of information that pointed to someone who had been observing the family. Hours later, Mel Spiegel was located in Boise. He was calm and cooperative, providing an alibi corroborated by his family. He explained that Sarah had access to his guest house, which was common knowledge to the family. With Mel cleared, the investigators were left with a new, horrifying realization. The evidence they found pointed not to an outside killer, but to a person within the family. The bloody bathrobe, in particular, was a pivotal piece of evidence. The forensic analysis revealed a grim truth. The robe contained DNA from both Alan and Diane, as well as Sarah. The DNA results from the latex glove also pointed to a single person, Sarah Johnson. The search for an outside killer was officially over. The chase, the forensic work, the interrogation of Mel Spiegel. It was all a dance around a truth that was hiding in plain sight. Sarah Johnson, the terrified girl who ran screaming to her neighbor, was in fact the killer. The narrative of the victim had been brutally rewritten, and the true horror of the crime began to take shape. In a cold, sterile interrogation room, Sarah sat alone. The atmosphere was no longer one of gentle inquiry, but of grim resolve. Sergeant Femling sat across from her, a mask of grim determination on his face. The investigators laid out the cold, hard facts, dismantling her fabricated story piece by piece. They spoke of the blood spatter found in her own room, a damning detail that contradicted her account of fleeing without entering her parents' room. They presented the evidence of the bloody bathrobe from the trash, explaining how the DNA of both her parents and her own had been found upon it. Her carefully constructed mask of innocence began to crack, her denials growing more frantic as the weight of the evidence pressed in upon her. She had concocted a series of stories, each one slightly different from the last, to explain her actions and her presence in the house. Initially, she claimed to have heard the shots from her room and fled. Then, she claimed to have seen blood before running. Each lie, meant to obscure the truth, only served to highlight it. The motive for such a heinous act was revealed to be rooted in the deep subterranean conflicts that can fester within a family. Alan and Diane Johnson, caring parents, had become concerned about their daughter's new relationship. Sarah had been dating a 19-year-old illegal immigrant from Mexico named Bruno Santos. Her parents, worried for her safety and her future, had a plan to report Bruno to the police, which would lead to his deportation. To Sarah, this parental decision was a direct threat to her future, a violent severing of her first real love. The threat of losing Bruno became a motive for murder. It was a tragic confluence of a teenage love affair, a parental decision, and a moment of unfathomable rage. The police theorized that on the morning of September 2nd, Sarah, knowing the layout of the guest house and the habits of its occupant, retrieved the rifle from Mel Spiegel's unlocked closet. She then returned to her parents' bedroom, where her mother Diane was still asleep. She shot her mother in the head. Her father Alan, hearing the commotion, had exited the shower to investigate. In a moment of panic and rage, she shot him as well. She then, in a desperate and clumsy attempt to cover her tracks, removed her bloody clothing, wrapped it in a pink robe, and tossed it into the outdoor trash can. She then ran to her neighbor's house, barefoot and feigning a state of terror. The irony was palpable. She was indeed terrified, but not of an unknown killer. She was terrified of the consequences of her own actions. The arrest of Sarah Johnson sent a shockwave through the small, tight-knit community of Bellevue. The quiet suburban enclave was now the center of a national media firestorm. The image of the grieving daughter was replaced by the terrifying reality of a cold and calculating killer. The news spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of a public fascinated by the dark underbelly of human nature. The trial of Sarah Johnson became a media circus. The small courthouse in Haley, Idaho, was overwhelmed by journalists, spectators, and true crime enthusiasts. The prosecution, led by a relentless prosecutor, painted a picture of a cold and calculating killer, a teenage girl who betrayed her parents for a boy. They meticulously presented their evidence, each piece a damning indictment. The bloody bathrobe, the DNA evidence, the unspent cartridges found in her room, and the bullet fragments that matched the Winchester rifle, all told a single, irrefutable story. They presented a motive born of teenage infatuation and a terrifyingly callous disregard for human life. The defense, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that Sarah's confession was coerced, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the police had been blinded by tunnel vision, ignoring other potential suspects. They brought up the unidentified fingerprints found on the rifle, attempting to plant doubt in the minds of the jury. They argued that a girl of 16 could not have committed such a brutal crime. The defense portrayed Sarah as a scared, confused teenager, a victim of a terrible misunderstanding. They brought up the fact that there was no blood spatter on Sarah herself, arguing that she could not have been the shooter, but the prosecution countered, suggesting she had worn the robe backwards to shield herself from the spray of blood, a detail that painted her as even more deliberate in her actions. The trial lasted for weeks, a grim and fascinating spectacle. The courtroom was a stage for a battle between two competing narratives: the cold-blooded killer and the innocent victim. The emotional testimony of family, friends, and neighbors was juxtaposed with the cold, scientific analysis of the forensic evidence. The jury, after a long and difficult deliberation, returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Sarah, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, showed no emotion as the sentence was read: 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. The conviction of Sarah Johnson brought a grim sense of finality to the case, but it did not quell the public's fascination. The case became a subject of true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books. The question of how a seemingly normal teenager could commit such a monstrous act haunted the collective consciousness. The Johnson family, once a beacon of suburban tranquility, was now a cautionary tale of a family destroyed from within. Sarah Johnson's life sentence was a grim testament to the consequences of her actions. She was sent to prison, where she would spend the rest of her days. The legal proceedings did not end with her conviction, however. Her lawyers continued to file appeals, arguing for a new trial based on what they claimed was ineffective legal counsel and new evidence. They argued that the unidentified fingerprints on the rifle, which were later identified as belonging to a man named Christopher Hill, who had helped Mel Spiegel move in, were crucial. However, the courts consistently denied her appeals, citing the overwhelming evidence against her: the presence of her parents' DNA on the bathrobe she was wearing, the ammunition in her bedroom, and the inconsistent alibis she had provided all painted a picture of guilt that no amount of appeals could erase. The case of Alan and Diane Johnson became a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime. It was a story of betrayal, family conflict, and the brutal reality that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. It served as a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, hidden secrets and simmering resentments can lead to unimaginable tragedy. The quiet streets of Bellevue would forever be haunted by the memory of the scream that pierced the morning air and the gruesome tableau that lay hidden behind a closed bedroom door. The case left an indelible mark on the community, a painful scar that would never fully heal. It was a story of a daughter's crime and a family's demise, a new kind of normal for a town that had once known only peace. The Maria Lewis case, the quiet woods, and a tangled web. The forest floor was a tapestry of decay, a quiet mosaic of damp leaves and crumbling branches beneath the ancient canopy of the woods. For years, the land had remained undisturbed, its silence broken only by the whispers of the wind and the rustle of unseen creatures. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the seasons turned in a slow, relentless cycle, and the secrets of the earth were buried deep. It was here, in a small, hidden clearing, that the body of Maria Lewis was discovered. The silence was pierced not by a human scream, but by the startled cry of a hiker who stumbled upon a mound of freshly turned earth, an incongruous scar upon the ancient landscape. The body was not merely buried, it was a scene of calculated, almost artistic violence. It lay beneath a shallow layer of soil, a grim monument to a terrifying end. The authorities arrived, their bright uniforms and flashing lights, a stark contrast to the natural gloom of the woods. The air, once thick with the scent of pine and rich soil, was now tainted with the sterile odor of chemical preservation and the metallic tang of something far more sinister. The body was identified as that of Maria Louie, a young woman who had been missing for over a month. The forensic team worked with a quiet efficiency, their movements precise and their purpose grim. The details of the crime were horrifying in their methodical cruelty. The body had been brutalized, a series of acts that spoke not of a moment of passionate rage, but of a prolonged and methodical assault. The scene was devoid of any immediate clues, no discarded weapon, no footprint that could be definitively traced, no stray piece of clothing. It was as if the killer had taken great care to erase their presence, leaving only the victim as a testament to their crime. As the investigation unfolded, the threads of Maria Louise's life began to unravel. She was a woman who had moved through a world of shadows, a life of secrets and clandestine meetings. Her friends and family spoke of a vivacious young woman, full of light and laughter, but the police found a hidden existence, a second life lived under a cloak of secrecy. They discovered a series of relationships, each one fraught with tension and underlying violence. Her last known communication was with 3 men, Herrera, Harry Bowden, and Luis Carlos Miranda. Each man had a connection to her, a tangled web of shared history, secrets, and resentments. The police, with a methodical focus, began to untangle this web, their attention drawn to the last days of Maria's life. Herrera was the first to be taken in for questioning. He was a man with a history of minor offenses, a life on the fringes of society. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, his alibi flimsy and easily discredited. He spoke of a volatile relationship with Maria, a bond of codependency and mutual destruction. The police found evidence of a violent struggle in his apartment, traces of blood that were later confirmed to be Maria's. The psychological profile of the killer began to take shape, a person driven by a twisted sense of entitlement and a dark, possessive rage. Herrera's narrative was one of a love turned sour, a fantasy of control and ownership that had spiraled into an act of unimaginable brutality. The details of his account, which veered into the realm of fantasy, seemed to echo the very nature of Maria's final moments, a terrifying reflection of a mind untethered from reality. Harry Bowden and Luis Carlos Miranda were also brought in for questioning. They were men of a different sort, individuals with more to lose, and their stories were carefully crafted, a fortress of alibis and legal protections. Bowden was a well-respected figure in the community, a man with a public image of benevolence and civic duty. Miranda was his close associate, a man whose life was inextricably linked to Bowden's. The police found no direct evidence to tie them to the crime. Their movements on the night of the murder were accounted for, their stories corroborated by multiple witnesses. Despite the deep suspicion that lingered around their involvement, the legal proceedings that followed could not find a way to place them at the scene of the crime or to directly link them to the murder. The legal proceedings were a long, drawn-out battle in a cold, unforgiving courtroom. The prosecution focused its case entirely on Herrera, building a mountain of circumstantial evidence, psychological profiles, and forensics that painted him as the sole perpetrator. The defense in turn fought tirelessly, attempting to dismantle the prosecution's case, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the police had been too quick to close the case, ignoring other viable suspects. The trial was a grim and fascinating spectacle, a public airing of a private tragedy. The jury, after a long and difficult deliberation, found Herrera guilty. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and for a time it seemed that justice had been served. However, the case was far from resolved. The conviction of Herrera brought a grim sense of finality to the legal proceedings. But for the Asino family, Maria's relatives, the verdict was only a partial victory. They remained deeply unsatisfied with the acquittal of Harry Bowden and Luis Carlos Miranda. They believed that there was a deeper level of conspiracy at play, a concealment or defense mechanism that had allowed the other two men to evade justice. This lingering suspicion was compounded by a bizarre and disturbing incident after the trial. Maria's personal belongings, which the family had hoped to preserve as evidence for future legal action, were returned to them soaked in blood. The authorities could offer no explanation, and the incident left the family with a profound sense of unease. It was an act that seemed to confirm their worst fears, a silent message that the truth was far more complex and sinister than the court had been willing to admit. The Maria Louie case became a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime, a cautionary tale of a brutal murder and a legal system that, in the eyes of some, had failed to deliver a complete measure of justice. The story of Maria's life and death was replayed in countless documentaries and books, each one trying to make sense of the tangled web of relationships and secrets that had led to her demise. The forest where her body was found, once a place of quiet solitude, was now a grim tourist destination, a place where people came to stand in the shadow of a terrible crime. The case left an indelible mark on the community, a painful scar that would never fully heal. The conviction of Herrera brought a sense of closure, but the acquittal of Bowden and Miranda left a bitter taste in the mouth of many, a nagging sense that a part of the truth had been buried just as surely as Maria's body in the quiet woods. The family's frustration was a constant undercurrent, a quiet storm of grief and unanswered questions. They knew in their hearts that there was more to the story, a layer of corruption or complicity that had allowed two men to walk free. The bloody belongings, the inexplicable lack of evidence, the carefully constructed alibis, all of it pointed to a deeper conspiracy. The family, driven by a profound need for justice, refused to give up. They held press conferences, petitioned the courts, and hired private investigators, determined to expose what they believed was a deliberate act of concealment. But their efforts were met with legal stonewalling and a wall of silence. The state, having secured a conviction, was unwilling to revisit the case, and Bowden and Miranda, shielded by their acquittal, went on with their lives, their public images intact. The case remained an open wound for the family, a symbol of their powerlessness in the face of a system that they felt had betrayed them. They continued to live with the knowledge that two men they believed were responsible for their daughter's death were free. The story of Maria Louie was a modern tragedy, a tale of a young life cut short, and a family's relentless pursuit of a justice that remained just out of reach. And the woods where she was found would forever hold the memory of her final moments, and the community would forever be haunted by the question of what truly happened on that day, and who was ultimately responsible for her death. The legal landscape of the case was a complex and frustrating one. The defense had argued that the prosecution's case was built on a flimsy foundation, a house of cards that would collapse under the slightest scrutiny. They highlighted the lack of physical evidence linking Herrera directly to the murder weapon or the dismemberment of the body. They suggested that the DNA found in his apartment could have been from a consensual encounter that had nothing to do with the murder. The defense's fingerprint expert testified that the prints found on some of Maria's belongings were smudged and unidentifiable, a detail they used to argue that the killer had worn gloves, something that would contradict the prosecution's theory of a crime of passion. They also pointed to the fact that Maria's body was found in a remote location, a place that Herrera, with his limited resources and lack of a vehicle, would have found difficult to access. The prosecution, however, had a compelling narrative. They argued that the totality of the evidence, while circumstantial, painted an irrefutable picture of guilt. They presented expert testimony from a forensic psychologist who argued that Herrera's obsessive and possessive personality, combined with his history of minor violence, made him a prime candidate for the crime. They argued that he had meticulously planned the murder, taking care to clean up the crime scene and dispose of the body in a way that would make it difficult to find. They suggested that he may have had an accomplice, but they did not have enough evidence to charge anyone else. They argued that the lack of fingerprints was a sign of a meticulous and calculating mind, a person who had taken great care to erase their presence. They painted a picture of a man driven by a twisted and dangerous love, a man who, in a moment of extreme rage, had taken a life and then, in a cold and calculated manner, had disposed of the evidence. The jury, swayed by the overwhelming emotional weight of the prosecution's case and the damning psychological evidence, had ultimately decided to convict. For the Acino family, the conviction was a bittersweet victory. They had wanted justice for their daughter, but they had also wanted the truth. They believed that the legal system had been too quick to close the case, too willing to accept a simple narrative of a lone killer, when the reality was far more complex. They had watched as Baden and Miranda, two men they believed to be complicit in their daughter's death, had walked free, their public images unblemished. The family's pursuit of justice became a full-time obsession. They spent countless hours and their life savings on private investigators, attempting to find the proof that the police had failed to uncover. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined the evidence, and followed every lead, no matter how small. They were driven by a profound sense of duty to their daughter, a need to see her true killers brought to justice. Their efforts were not without some small victories. They discovered that Bowden and Miranda had been in the vicinity of the crime scene on the night of the murder, a detail that had been overlooked by the police. They found a witness who had seen them in a car near the woods, a detail that contradicted their carefully constructed alibis. They brought this evidence to the attention of the authorities, but their pleas for a new investigation were met with a wall of legal red tape. The state argued that the new evidence was not substantial enough to overturn the previous verdict, and that the case was legally closed. The family was left in a state of limbo, their search for justice a perpetual and agonizing journey. The case of Maria Louis became a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime, a grim and haunting story of a young life cut short and a family's relentless pursuit of a justice that remained just out of reach. The woods where her body was found would forever hold the memory of her final moments, and the community would forever be haunted by the question of what truly happened on that day, and who was ultimately responsible for her death. The case left an indelible mark on the community, a painful scar that would never fully heal. It was a story of a daughter's death and a family's unwavering determination, a new kind of normal for a town that had once known only peace. The Acino family's grief was a public and private affair, a relentless battle against a legal system that they felt had failed them. They would continue to fight, driven by a profound sense of love and a need to see their daughter's true killers brought to justice, no matter how long it took. The case was a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, hidden secrets and simmering resentments can lead to unimaginable tragedy. The quiet streets of the town would forever be haunted by the memory of the scream that pierced the morning air and the gruesome tableau that lay hidden in the woods. The story of Maria Louis was a modern tragedy, a tale of a young life cut short and a family's relentless pursuit of a justice that remained just out of reach. The Neil Entwistle case, the family's unraveling dream, the peaceful town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, became the setting for a story that would capture the attention of an entire nation. It was a tale of love, deceit, and a devastating tragedy that tore apart the illusion of a perfect life. At the heart of it were Neil Entwistle, a man from Britain, and Rachel Souza, an American woman, a couple who seemed to have everything with their new baby, but who were, in truth, hiding profound tensions. Neil Entwistle was born in Worksop, England, in 1978. His upbringing was a modest one, with his father working as a miner and his mother as a school cook. He pursued his education at the University of York, where he studied electronic engineering and business management. It was there, at university, that his path crossed with that of Rachel Souza, a vivacious American student who was studying abroad. Rachel, a native of Kingston, Massachusetts, was a student at Holy Cross College and had chosen to spend a year at York University. Their personalities were a study in contrasts. Neil was known to be a reserved and quiet individual, not particularly social, a man of a more subdued nature. Rachel, on the other hand, was full of life and popular within her community, her American background adding a unique charm to her personality. They were both members of the university rowing team, a shared passion that brought them together. As their relationship deepened, they became inseparable, their bond marked by a strong sense of ease and genuine affection. Following their time at university, the couple embarked on their respective careers. Neil secured a position at a defense technology and security company. He would later jokingly describe his work as making bombs and other items. Rachel dedicated herself to her career in education, teaching English, drama, and theater studies at a Catholic high school in Reading. Their engagement was a source of great happiness, and Neil proudly announced that he was going to marry the most amazing woman he had met through rowing. In 2003, they formalized their union with 2 wedding ceremonies, one in Plymouth, UK, and another in Massachusetts. They settled in Worcester, and Neil shared memories of their married life on a family website he created. The year 2005 marked a pivotal moment in their lives with the arrival of their daughter, Lillian Rose. This new addition prompted a major life change. The family decided to relocate to the United States. Initially, they stayed with Rachel's mother and stepfather in Carver, Massachusetts, before finding a home of their own in Hopkinton. Their new residence was a 5-bedroom colonial-style rental property situated on a quiet cul-de-sac, a setting that seemed to promise a tranquil and idyllic life. However, the idyllic facade began to crack under the weight of unforeseen challenges. The move to the United States was motivated by the desire for a better life, but it brought with it significant financial strain. Neil's income from his new job was a mere fraction of what he had earned in the UK, leading to a mounting debt that he was desperate to conceal from his wife. He was a man consumed by a constant need to maintain an appearance of success, and this facade was beginning to crumble. He had a habit of spending excessively on things he did not need, and a trail of unpaid bills began to accumulate. A credit card bill from HSBC in the amount of £25,000, a bill he had carefully hidden from Rachel, was a testament to his secretive financial life. The situation grew more desperate as his debts mounted. He had borrowed money from his parents, his brother, and his wife's parents, always with the promise of swift repayment. Yet, the promised repayments never came. He even went so far as to forge a document to secure a loan from the Royal Bank of Scotland, a loan he used to buy a car. His financial deceptions were not limited to his family. He had a history of manipulating his employer, making false claims about his living situation to secure extra funds. He had also attempted to deceive a credit union, but his scheme was thwarted by a vigilant employee. The financial desperation was a constant undercurrent to their seemingly perfect life, a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable collapse. On January 21st, 2006, The Entwistle family seemed to vanish without a trace. Alarmed by their sudden disappearance, Rachel's mother, Priscilla, went to their Hopkinton home. The house was eerily quiet, the windows and doors locked, and the cars were gone. She entered with a spare key and found the house in disarray, with a television and DVD player in a back bedroom, an unusual detail that immediately raised her suspicions. The air was still and heavy, and a profound sense of unease filled the house. On the bed, Priscilla made a grim discovery: a plastic bag with a black t-shirt and what appeared to be dried blood. A black duffel bag was also found, and inside, a series of unsettling items, including credit card statements, Neil's passport, and a photo of his brother. The discovery of the blood-stained bag prompted Priscilla to contact the authorities, a decision that would unravel the full horror of the situation. The police arrived, and a methodical search of the house began. The air was filled with a growing sense of dread as the search continued. A dog trained to detect human remains was brought in, and its frantic barks led investigators to the master bedroom. There, in the bed, they found the bodies of Rachel and Lillian Rose, covered with blankets and a comforter. Rachel had been shot once in the head, and her daughter had been shot once in the torso. The medical examiner determined that their deaths had occurred sometime after January 20th. The search for a suspect began immediately, and all attention turned to the missing husband and father, Neil Entwistle. The police issued a warrant for his arrest, believing he had fled the country. A review of his passport records confirmed their suspicions. He had taken a flight from Boston to London, and a subsequent flight to Heathrow. He had managed to board the plane with only a single backpack, leaving his wife and daughter's bodies behind. In London, he was picked up by his parents, Clifford and Yvonne, and together they went to the home of a close friend. The media attention on the case was immediate and intense, with headlines about the wicked and cold-blooded British father. The British press, in particular, followed the story closely. Neil, however, maintained his innocence, claiming he had discovered his wife and daughter dead and had panicked, fleeing the country out of fear. He claimed that he had been in the basement of the house and had heard a series of loud bangs. He said he went upstairs to find his family murdered, and in a state of shock and fear, he fled. He claimed to have bought a one-way ticket to England using money he had in his bank account. However, his story was riddled with inconsistencies. His demeanor in interviews was calm and almost detached. He spoke of his love for his family in a way that seemed to lack genuine emotion, and he showed no signs of the grief or anguish that one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife and daughter. He told a friend that he had gone for a drive with his family, that they had an argument, and that he had dropped them off at a park before returning home. This story, like his other accounts, was a lie. The police were able to use his GPS data to show that the car never left their property. The search for the murder weapon led investigators to believe it was a .22 caliber revolver that Neil had bought on the internet. He had purchased the weapon just 2 weeks before the murders, and it was the same caliber as the gun used in the crime. The revolver was never found, but investigators believed that he had sold it or disposed of it before he fled the country. They had a mountain of evidence against him, from his mounting debts to his purchase of the murder weapon, to the inconsistencies in his stories. The evidence pointed to a calculated, cold-blooded act, not a crime of panic or a random act of violence. The legal process to extradite Neil from England to the United States was a long and arduous one. His lawyers fought tirelessly to prevent his return, but the American and British authorities worked together to ensure that he would face justice. After months of legal wrangling, a British judge ruled that there was enough evidence to extradite him. On July 19, 2006, Neil was flown back to Boston, where he was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial of Neil Entwistle began on June 20, 2008, and the courtroom was a stage for a grim and fascinating spectacle. The prosecution, led by a relentless team of lawyers, meticulously presented their case. They argued that Neil had a deep and long-standing history of financial deceit, and that he was facing the complete and utter collapse of his life. They argued that he had killed his family to avoid the shame and humiliation of his lies being exposed. They presented evidence of his massive debt, his purchase of the murder weapon, his frantic attempts to cover his tracks, and his flight to England. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence. They presented a narrative of a loving husband and father who had been wrongly accused. They argued that Neil had panicked after finding his family murdered and had fled out of fear, not guilt. They pointed to the fact that there was no physical evidence linking him directly to the murders. They suggested that an unknown intruder had committed the crime and that Neil had been a victim of a terrible coincidence. However, the prosecution's case was too strong. They had a compelling narrative that explained his motives, his actions, and his flight. They showed that he had been living a lie, and that the murder of his family was the desperate act of a man who was out of options. They presented evidence of his internet searches, which revealed a morbid interest in murder, crime, and weapons. The jury, after a long and difficult deliberation, returned with a verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The conviction of Neil Entwistle brought a grim sense of finality to the case. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a grim testament to the consequences of his actions. The case became a subject of true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books, and the question of how a seemingly normal family man could commit such a monstrous act haunted the collective consciousness. The tragic deaths of Rachel and Lillian Rose left a profound emptiness in the hearts of those who knew and loved them, and their story became a poignant reflection of the unseen challenges that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect existences. The courtroom was a stage for a grim and meticulous drama. As the trial of Neil Entwistle began, the prosecution systematically dismantled the facade of a happy family man, revealing a life built on a foundation of deception and financial desperation. They painted a picture of a man who, unable to face the shame of his lies, had chosen a path of unimaginable violence. The jury was presented with a timeline of Neil's escalating debt, a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly to the Hopkinton home. Witnesses testified about his secret life, his excessive spending on items he couldn't afford, and his desperate pleas for money from family members on both sides of the Atlantic. The narrative of a loving husband and father was replaced by the terrifying reality of a man trapped by his own deceptions. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the internet search history recovered from his computer. The search queries were a chilling testament to a mind consumed by a dark and morbid obsession. He had searched for information on how to obtain a gun, how to commit murder, and how to get away with it. The searches were not random. They were a roadmap to the crime. He had researched specific firearms, including the .22 caliber revolver that was believed to be the murder weapon. He had also looked into the logistics of murder, searching for ways to dispose of a body and how to cross international borders without raising suspicion. The prosecution argued that these searches were not the actions of an innocent man, but a clear sign of premeditation. The defense attempted to discredit this evidence, arguing that the searches were merely a manifestation of a morbid curiosity, a casual exploration of a dark subject. However, the sheer volume and specificity of the searches made their argument difficult to believe. The forensic evidence, while not as abundant as in other cases, was still compelling. The ballistics report confirmed that the bullets removed from Rachel and Lillian's bodies were consistent with a .22 caliber handgun. While the murder weapon was never found, the prosecution was able to connect Neil to the purchase of such a weapon through his online transactions. A small amount of blood found on a duffel bag in the house, a bag that Neil had left behind, was later confirmed to be Rachel's. This discovery, while not a direct link to the murders themselves, supported the prosecution's theory that Neil had been in the house after the murders and had attempted to clean up the crime scene before fleeing. The defense argued that the blood could have come from a number of sources: a small cut, a nosebleed, or a kitchen accident, but the timing and location of the discovery made their argument seem weak. The prosecution also presented a compelling psychological profile of Neil. He was described as a man with a fragile ego, a person who was so terrified of public failure that he would go to any length to conceal his shortcomings. His life, a carefully constructed edifice of lies, was on the verge of collapsing. The prosecution argued that the murder of his family was not an act of rage, but an act of desperate control. He had killed them not out of hatred, but out of a profound and terrifying selfishness. He had decided that a life without the financial burden and the threat of exposure was more important than the lives of his wife and daughter. The defense attempted to counter this by presenting character witnesses who spoke of Neil as a kind and loving man, but their testimony was overshadowed by the mountain of evidence that contradicted their claims. The trial was also marked by the poignant and heartbreaking testimony of Rachel's family. Her mother, Priscilla, spoke of her unease with Neil, her growing suspicion that he was not who he seemed to be. She testified about the moment she discovered the bodies, a moment of profound horror that had changed her life forever. The raw emotion of her testimony, a mother's grief and a grandmother's anguish, had a powerful effect on the courtroom. The jury, faced with the cold scientific evidence and the deeply human testimony of a grieving family, had a difficult task ahead of them. After a long and difficult deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. The relief that justice had been served, and the sorrow that 2 innocent lives had been lost so senselessly. Neil, who had shown little emotion throughout the trial, remained stoic, a mask of indifference concealing any inner turmoil he may have felt. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a grim and final end to a life built on a foundation of lies. The aftermath of the trial was a long and painful process for all involved. The tragedy of the case continued to unfold even after the verdict was delivered. Neil was initially incarcerated at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Norfolk, but his life in prison was not one of peace. He was a high-profile inmate, a man whose crime had shocked the conscience of a nation. He faced constant threats and violence from other inmates, who, aware of the nature of his crime, sought to punish him. The constant threat to his life led to his transfer to a different facility, the Old Colony Correctional Center, a medium-security prison. The Department of Correction confirmed that the transfer was made for Neil's safety, a grim irony for a man who had taken the lives of his own family. The legal proceedings did not end with his conviction. Neil's lawyers continued to file appeals, arguing that the verdict was not supported by the evidence and that their client had been a victim of a miscarriage of justice. They argued that the prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial and that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than fact. They pointed to the lack of a murder weapon and the inconclusive nature of some of the forensic evidence. However, The courts consistently denied his appeals, citing the overwhelming evidence against him, including the internet search history and his flight from the country. The tragic deaths of Rachel and Lillian Rose left a profound emptiness in the hearts of those who knew and loved them. Their passing served as a stark reminder of the vibrant lives that were abruptly cut short in the aftermath of this heartbreaking loss. The community came together, providing unwavering support and comfort to the grieving families. Their unity and strength during such adversity demonstrated the remarkable resilience and compassion that can reside within humanity. The narrative of Neil Entwistle and Rachel Souza stands as a poignant reflection of the unseen challenges that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect existences. Their stories served as a somber yet powerful call to prioritize empathy, support, and appreciation in our interactions with one another. It was a painful lesson that the most beautiful facades can hide the darkest of secrets, and that sometimes a new life can lead to an unspeakable end. The story of Neil Entwistle became a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime, a grim and haunting tale of a man's descent into darkness and a family's tragic end. It was a story that would forever haunt the quiet streets of Hopkinton, a constant reminder of the day the illusion of a perfect life was shattered by a single terrible act. The memory of Rachel and Lillian Rose would live on, not as a symbol of their tragic deaths, but as a testament to the love and light they brought into the world, a light that was extinguished far too soon. The Michael and Catherine Borden case, an American tragedy. The story of the Borden family unfolded not in a grand dramatic theater, but in the quiet, unassuming landscape of the American Midwest. The genesis of their lives together began in the ordinary hallways of a Missouri school, a setting where youthful innocence often collides with the first sparks of attraction. It was here that Michael first saw Catherine, a young woman with radiant blonde hair and a responsive spirit that immediately captivated him. His efforts to get her attention were simple and genuine, a series of small, persistent acts offering help with homework, extending invitations for leisurely walks. Over time, these gestures, born of a quiet admiration, nurtured a deep and abiding friendship. They spent countless hours together, sharing the mundane details of their academic lives and the burgeoning secrets of their hearts. Their bond, initially a platonic connection, deepened into a profound and all-consuming love, a realization that dawned on them with the gentle inevitability of a new season. On a date, in a moment of tender vulnerability, Michael first articulated the feelings that had long been a silent presence between them, solidifying a love that would become the central pillar of their existence. Their union was consecrated in a beautiful and memorable ceremony, a public declaration of a private promise to love one another through all of life's unpredictable circumstances. For a decade, they lived in Missouri, their lives a steady rhythm of shared purpose and growing affection. But the world beyond their quiet haven, with its cacophony of modern complexities and challenges, was a source of growing concern. They sought an escape, a refuge for the family they hoped to build. Their search led them to Lititz, Pennsylvania, a town steeped in the traditions of its Moravian founders, a community of faithful families who had sought to shield themselves from the perceived horrors of contemporary life. This tranquil enclave, with its quiet streets and simple way of life, seemed perfectly suited for the birth and upbringing of children, a place where life flowed with a calming predictability, a new day, a gentle reflection of the last. This was the solitude and spiritual sanctuary the Bordens so desperately craved, a place to create a family in peace with God. Michael, a man of deep faith, found a sense of purpose in the local church community, where he served with a quiet dedication, teaching lessons in Sunday school. Catherine, a woman of equal devotion, managed their household, a world of her own creation, and assisted her husband in his community work. While Michael worked to build spiritual wealth for his family, he also toiled in the secular world as a manager at a printing company to meet their worldly needs. In the years that followed, their family grew, a testament to the life they had built in this peaceful sanctuary. They were blessed with 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, a large family that was not uncommon in this close-knit Christian community. They hoped to shield their children from the hardships and dangers of the larger world, immersing them in the rhythms of church life and homeschooling. Their interactions with the outside world were limited to joint religious societies and celebrations, a life of intentional separation from the perceived corruptions of modern society. For many years, the family model created by Michael remained a source of immense pride, their children raised in an environment of faith, discipline, and profound innocence. The serene rhythm of their lives began to change as the eldest sons reached adulthood and departed for university, leaving 3 younger children at home. To the delight of their parents, the remaining children continued their homeschooling, excelling in their studies and diverse interests. Neighbors and the couple's few friends spoke highly of their upbringing, describing them as kind, responsive, and exemplary. The Borden family was a living testament to the success of their chosen lifestyle, a model of virtue and a source of quiet admiration in their community. Yet beneath this seemingly perfect surface, a different story was about to unfold. The quiet rebellion began when their eldest daughter, Kara, entered her teenage years. Her burgeoning independence and desire for a life beyond the confines of their strict religious upbringing began to clash with the family's traditional ways. Despite her father's prohibitions, she began to engage in activities that were anathema to their beliefs. She joined a local soccer team, a bold act of defiance, and would sneak out of the house to attend discos, doing everything she had been forbidden to do. Her behavior, a silent rebellion against her upbringing, deeply shook her father. Hours of conversations and stern instructions failed to resonate in her heart. Their home, once a bastion of peace, became a stage for arguments, each one a testament to the growing chasm between father and daughter. Kara, a young woman in the throes of a nascent independence, openly showed interest in young men and sought relationships, a natural desire that was entirely at odds with her parents' conservative worldview. In 2005, a significant event occurred that would forever alter the Borden family's trajectory. Kara, then 14, met David Ludwig, an 18-year-old, in a support group for students involved in homeschooling issues. The young people, drawn to one another by the shared experience of a sheltered existence and the passionate attraction to all things forbidden, quickly established a warm and friendly rapport. Their initial connection, a mutual understanding of their isolated lives, deepened into something more. They secretly created social media profiles where they began an active and emotional correspondence, a coded language of love and longing that they carefully guarded from their parents. The exchange of messages soon proved insufficient, and they began to meet in secret. Their clandestine meetings, initially harmless walks in quiet, secluded places, evolved into a romantic relationship, a passionate and defiant bond forged in secrecy. They ran away together at night to discos and spent time together until morning, a series of small, thrilling rebellions that fed their growing love. Kara, in the first flush of her new and bright feelings, was unrecognizable to those who knew her. Her quiet defiance was replaced by a visible happiness. She seemed to float through her days, a joyful smile never leaving her face. Her father, overjoyed, believed that the teenage challenges were a thing of the past, unaware that her newfound obedience was merely the fear of being discovered, a quiet and sorrowful sacrifice to her secret love. The story of the Borden family continued to unfold, a tragic narrative of forbidden love and a family's descent into darkness. Kara, a young woman caught between a father's strict beliefs and a new passionate love, had begun to live a double life. Her clandestine relationship with David Ludwig was a thrilling rebellion, a source of joy and freedom she had never known. The hours she spent with him, the nights she snuck out, were a testament to a desire for a life beyond the confines of her sheltered existence. Her father, Michael, a man of deep faith and unshakable conviction, was blinded by her newfound obedience, mistaking her compliance for a return to their traditional ways. He believed the turmoil of her teenage years was a thing of the past, unaware that her quiet demeanor was merely the fear of being discovered. The silence that had once defined their home was now a tense quiet, a prelude to a storm. The year 2005 marked a turning point in this quiet tragedy. In the summer of that year, David Ludwig and Kara's relationship deepened. They exchanged heartfelt letters and spent time together until morning, each stolen moment a defiance of the rules that governed Kara's life. But this forbidden love was a ticking clock. Kara's father, ever vigilant, began to grow suspicious of his daughter's late-night departures and her increasingly withdrawn demeanor. He began to question her, his once gentle inquiries turning into a persistent and fearful interrogation. The truth, once a carefully guarded secret, was on the verge of being exposed. The confrontation came in the form of a simple, innocuous question. Michael, sensing that something was wrong, asked Kara if she had been seeing someone. The direct question, a simple and honest attempt at connection, was met with a lie. Kara, terrified of her father's reaction, denied everything, but her lie was transparent. Michael, a man who had dedicated his life to truth and faith, was filled with a profound sense of betrayal. His anger, a quiet and controlled fury, grew with each denial. He then turned his suspicions to David Ludwig, a boy he had only heard about in passing. He called him a desperate and misguided attempt to find the truth. David, a young man consumed by a love he had fought to protect, also lied, denying any romantic involvement with Kara. The conversation ended with a promise from Michael to tell David's parents about the whole situation. The confrontation at the Borden home was a slow-motion descent into chaos. Michael, a man of deep religious conviction, was faced with the reality that his children, a source of immense pride, were living a life of deceit. He and Catherine, his steadfast partner, confronted Kara, a heartbreaking conversation of shattered trust and broken promises. They discovered the full extent of her relationship with David, the secret social media profiles, the clandestine meetings, the nights spent together. Catherine's reaction was one of sorrow and disappointment, a gentle sadness that mirrored the pain in her heart. Michael's reaction was one of a far more violent emotion. The father, who had once radiated an aura of quiet love, was now filled with a righteous anger. He was a man whose world, a carefully constructed edifice of faith and control, was crumbling before his eyes. He took Kara's phone and computer, a final desperate attempt to sever the connection to the outside world. He then told her that he would call David's parents and would tell the family of the moral outrage they were a part of. The family of David was also devoutly religious, and Michael believed that the threat of exposing the truth to them would put an end to the relationship. The night of the tragic outcome began with a series of calls between David and Kara. They were in a state of utter panic, their world on the verge of collapsing. The calls, filled with a desperate sense of urgency, were a testament to their deep and all-consuming love. They decided to run away together, a final desperate attempt to preserve the one thing that mattered to them. They were two young lovers, frightened and alone, with nowhere to go. David's desperation, fueled by a fear of losing the person he loved most in the world, was growing with each passing moment. He had decided that he would do anything to protect Kara, even if it meant confronting her father. The confrontation between David and Michael Borden was a clash of two worlds. It was a meeting between a young man whose love for a girl had caused him to act with a reckless and dangerous passion, and a father whose love for his daughter had turned into a desperate and controlling anger. In the early hours of the next day, David, in a car he had stolen from his parents' home, arrived at the Borden residence. He was armed with a handgun, a final, terrible symbol of his desperation. He had come to confront Michael, a man he saw not as a father, but as a roadblock to his happiness. The confrontation was brief and brutal. In the darkness of the early morning, a single gunshot rang out, shattering the quiet of the sleepy town. The bullet struck Michael, a tragic and fatal end to a life lived in faith and a death brought about by a young man's misguided love. Following the shooting, a frantic series of events unfolded. Catherine, her heart filled with a profound and terrible fear, found her husband's body. She immediately called the police, her voice a reedy whisper of terror. David, in a state of shock and panic, fled the scene with Kara. They were two young people, now fugitives, with a terrible secret. They were alone in the world, with nowhere to go, their future a grim and uncertain prospect. They spent the night in an abandoned garage, a brief and terrifying respite from their new reality. They would spend the next several days on the run, their story a constant presence in the national media, a grim and fascinating spectacle of a tragic love story gone horribly wrong. They drove from state to state, their fear growing with each passing mile, their love story now a crime story. The police investigation was a meticulous and determined effort to track down the young fugitives. The national media, captivated by the tragic tale, broadcast their images on every news channel, a constant presence on television screens across the country. The public was transfixed, their attention drawn to the grim and fascinating story of a father's murder and a daughter's flight. The police, with the help of the media, were able to track their movements, following a trail of abandoned vehicles and surveillance footage. The manhunt, a tense and desperate race against time, finally came to an end when they were found and arrested in Indiana. They were alone, frightened, and exhausted, two young people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by a single terrible act. The story of the Borden family continued its tragic arc, a narrative of faith, control, and a love that defied all boundaries. The initial narrative, one of a quiet life lived in a peaceful town, had been shattered by a single terrible act. The flight of Kara Borden and David Ludwig, two young people now fugitives, captivated the nation. Their images, a grim and constant presence on every news channel, became a symbol of a tragic love story gone horribly wrong. The manhunt, a tense and desperate race against time, concluded in Indiana, a state away from the scene of the crime. They were found, alone, frightened, and exhausted, their lives forever altered by a single terrible act. The legal proceedings that followed were a long and meticulous process, a public airing of a private tragedy. The prosecution, in a grim and methodical manner, laid out a timeline of events that had led to the murder of Michael Borden. They painted a picture of a loving father who, in a desperate attempt to protect his daughter, had been tragically caught in the crossfire of a forbidden love. They argued that David Ludwig, consumed by a possessive and violent passion, had a premeditated plan to confront and, if necessary, eliminate the obstacle to his happiness. The prosecution presented evidence of the stolen car, the handgun, and the desperate calls between David and Kara, a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly to the murder. The defense, on the other hand, argued for a different narrative. They portrayed David as a young man in the throes of a profound and irrational love, a boy who had acted in a moment of panic and desperation. They argued that the murder was not premeditated, but a tragic and spontaneous act of self-defense. They spoke of the deep, controlling nature of Michael Borden, a father who had created a home of such strict religious convictions that his daughter felt she had no choice but to run away. The defense painted a picture of a young couple, driven by a profound and all-consuming love, who had been pushed to the edge by a father's unyielding will. The trial was a clash of two competing narratives, a battle between a father's love and a lover's obsession. The courtroom was filled with the raw emotion of a grieving family and the calculated legal arguments of lawyers. The jury, faced with the overwhelming emotional weight of the case, had a difficult task ahead of them. David Ludwig's demeanor throughout the trial was one of a quiet and sullen indifference, a mask that hid a profound and terrible inner turmoil. He showed no remorse for his actions, a detail that was noted by both the prosecution and the media. His silence, a chilling and unreadable presence in the courtroom, was a testament to his emotional detachment from the crime. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of grim finality to the case. The jury, after a lengthy deliberation, found David Ludwig guilty of murder. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a grim and final end to a life that had once been filled with promise. For Kara Borden, the verdict was a complex and devastating experience. She had lost her father, the man who had raised her and loved her, and she had lost the man she loved, the person for whom she had risked everything. She was a young woman now, a victim and a participant in a crime that had torn her family apart. Her future was uncertain, a life lived in the shadow of a terrible tragedy. She would be forced to live with the knowledge that her love story had led to the death of her father and the imprisonment of the man she loved. The Borden family, once a bastion of faith and innocence, was forever changed. The death of Michael was a wound that would never fully heal. Catherine, now a widow, was left to raise her remaining children alone. The family, a model of virtue and a source of quiet admiration in their community, was now a cautionary tale of a family destroyed from within. The story of Michael and Catherine Borden was a modern tragedy, a tale of a young life cut short and a family's relentless pursuit of a justice that remained just out of reach. The quiet streets of Lititz, Pennsylvania, would forever be haunted by the memory of the scream that pierced the morning air and the gruesome tableau that lay hidden behind a closed bedroom door. The case left an indelible mark on the community, a painful scar that would never fully heal. It was a story of a daughter's crime and a family's demise, a new kind of normal for a town that had once known only peace. The legal proceedings would continue for years as the Borden family sought to come to terms with the profound loss and to find a way to move forward in the shadow of a crime that had defined their lives. The story of Michael and Catherine Borden was a grim and haunting tale of a man's descent into darkness and a family's tragic end. It was a story that would forever haunt the quiet streets of Lititz, a constant reminder of the day the illusion of a perfect life was shattered by a single terrible act. The memory of Michael and Catherine Borden would live on, not as a symbol of their tragic deaths, but as a testament to the love and light they brought into the world, a light that was extinguished far too soon.